Thank you very, very much to Shelley for sponsoring and preparing a delicious Mediterranean-style breakfast.
It's Mediterranean?
That's what Susie
That's
was
what I
talking
keep saying.
The cheese and
It's the cheese.
and the
More Israeli, yeah.
Yeah.
As opposed to Mediterranean?
Well, then you
So
have
today we
olives.
continue on with Chanah. You brought back the source sheet from last time. I'm not just going to do the second half. I reprinted it. I added more stuff because I have more time. So
Add more stuff to it, so it does she's longer
I
valid.
added more stuff. So the first half of the page now has different. What do you have? The old
I
one?
have the old one.
So here. It's a new one. It says Chanah part 2.
Okay, we got it.
Okay. Alright, so that's a review. We started to learn the story of Chanah, which contains a very crucial pasuk with regard to Tefillah v'Chana hi medaberes al liba, that when she went to pray because she was despondent for not having a family like Penina did, and or children like Penina did, so she went to the Mishkan in Shiloh to pray. And it says, v'Chana hi medaberes al liba, she was speaking to her in her heart. Rak spaseha naos v'kola lo yishamea. Only her lips moved and her voice could not be heard. And we learned last week that her voice not being heard is actually a very important part of tefillah. We learned that when daven Shemona Esrei, their voice should not be heard by other people. If possible, it's preferable to achieve a middle ground where you hear your own whispering, you can hear yourself davening, but no one else near you can hear. And if there's a conflict, if in order for you to hear yourself, other people next to you would have to hear you as well, better not to be heard whatsoever, even by yourself. And this is because the Tefillah Shemona Esrei is supposed to be privately said, and is not supposed to at all impinge upon anyone else's kavanah, or even to bring yourself into a situation where it might occur. Not even if you're sure that it would happen, but even if it might happen, that someone else would be disturbed, better not to make your voice heard at all. We learn that from Chanah. But the most essential part of that is not that her voice couldn't be heard, but that the whole purpose of it was to emphasize and to support and to encourage greater kavanah, which we discussed last week also. People think Kavanah means intent. Kavanah in Hebrew, the word kivun means direction. So I tried to translate here, a lot of the translation, to direct one's thoughts, to direct one's hearts, has a lot more than intent. To have intent is like, well, did you mean, discuss this, did you mean to kill him or did you not mean to kill him? That's a legal technicality. Did you intend to? It's really directing your heart, really a focus, a meditative purpose. So let's move on to reanalyze the second half of the pasuk, with Kola lo yishamea, that her voice could not be heard. Now let's go to the first half. V'Chana hi medaberes al liba, she was speaking in her heart. So the Gemara Brachos records a statement by Rabbi Hamnuna, who says there are many great things that we learned from Chanah. V'Chana hi medaberes al liba. From this phrase that she was speaking to her heart, we learn mikan l'mispalel tzarich sheyichavein libo. That here we learn that for whoever davens, they have to direct their heart. That's the Gemara Brachos. And the Rambam, so he has to have kavanah. Now the truth is, to take a step backwards, there's a great debate in Jewish law whether mitzvos tzrichos kavanah, whether to perform a mitzvah you have to have kavanah to fulfill the mitzvah. You have to direct your heart for it. And for those who come to Mincha Marvet Shul, this might be a little bit review for you. But the Rambam records in Hilchos Shofar, so it's relevant for us in many ways. After Rosh Hashanah, mitzvahs aseh shel Torah. This is the third source. Mitzvahs aseh shel Torah lishmoa tshuas hashofar berosh Hashanah. There is a mitzvah, as we all know, to hear the sound of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The mitzvah is in hearing it, and that's what make a bracha. Not to blow the shofar, but to hear the shofar. This is very significant, and we'll see why in a minute. So now let's see. I asked you, put forward a scenario. let's say a person who is not really that affiliated, not really that educated, doesn't necessarily come to Shul on Rosh Hashanah, but he's a Jewish fellow, and he's walking by, Main Street on Rosh Hashanah, and he hears, through an open window. I know I don't have windows at home, but let's say he hears through an open window. He hears the shofar blast. He wasn't aware of this Rosh Hashanah. He didn't actually know there's a mitzvah of blowing shofar, but he thinks to himself, "Oh, that's kind of a nice sound. I like it." Wonder what that instrument is. Does he fulfill his mitzvah of hearing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah?
You mean if he doesn't know it's the shofar?
He doesn't know it's the shofar.
He doesn't say amen.
He wasn't going there to. He didn't say amen to a bracha. He didn't go to perform a mitzvah. He heard it. It happens to be the mitzvah is hearing the sound. That is the mitzvah. So does he perform it without having intent to perform it?
No.
You perform any mitzvah without doing the blessing for it.
If you think yes, you can give me. A lot of you. How many think yes?
That he
Fulfills the mitzvah. So a handful. How many think not? More. There's more abstaining. Well, happens to be. The Rambam agrees with the nays. Look in source, the fourth source. This is from the Rambam in the laws of shofar. Hamisasek b'tekiyah shofar. V'hislame. If a person is occupied with blowing the shofar to practice, let's say he's practicing blowing the shofar Rosh Hashanah morning before shul. Does he fulfill his mitzvah? No. Lo yatsa yedei chovaso. He does not fulfill his obligation, even though he hears the shofar blowing. Right? V'chein hashamea min hamisasek lo yatsa. And so too, if you hear the shofar from someone who is just practicing, then you also do not fulfill your obligation. Furthermore, niskavin shomea latzeis yedei chovaso. If the listener had in mind to fulfill his obligation, but v'lo niskavin hatokea lahotzio, but the trumpeter, the guy blowing the shofar, did not have in mind for this guy to fulfill his obligation, or other way around. Oshen niskavin hatokea lahotzio, or the guy blowing the shofar, he had in mind that the other people listening should fulfill their obligation. V'lo niskavin hashomea latzeis. But the listener did not have in mind to fulfill his obligation. Lo yatzei yedei chovaso. In any of those cases, the listener does not fulfill his obligation. So what do you need? Ad sheyiskaven shomea umashmiya. Until sheyiskaven, the listener and the trumpeter both have to have intent for the listener to fulfill his mitzvah in order for him to actually fulfill it.
Does the shofar blower have to have intent for every single person, or is it just the person doing it in front of the whole congregation? He's certainly like.
It's a good question. I think it has to be a general intent that people listening should fulfill their obligation, and that's also it's a very crucial. I've said this before that we have a practice of saying the whole parak of Tehillim we recite 7 times before blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah morning, and for a lot of people, saying it all 7 times before the brachot start and before the shofar starts is difficult. If the brachot stop immediately reciting Tehillim. It's just a minhag. It's not an essential part of if you don't say the Tehillim, you'll still fulfill your obligation of shofar. But it's important while the brachos are being recited that we all have in mind and listening to the person blowing the shofar and the person making the brachos that we are going to fulfill our obligation through his. That's an important thing to have in mind. That we are going to fulfill our obligation through his blowing the shofar, and he too has the same idea in his head. That everyone listening is going to fulfill their obligation through his blowing the shofar.
He fulfills his own as well at that point.
Yes. He also has to have in mind to fulfill. He can't, right, this is very important.
He doesn't have to hear it from somebody else. He can hear it from himself.
Yes, as long as he hears it.
Right.
As long as he hears it.
What have you said?
Then he's not obligated in the mitzvah.
I probably can't blow it.
Deaf person is not obligated in the mitzvah. Yeah, in fact, deaf people are not obligated in most mitzvot. Like, yeah. For that matter also, although there are mitzvot that a deaf person can fulfill, like for instance shaking a lulav, like a Chanukah candle, things like that, but blowing the shofar, you have to hear the shofar from someone who himself can hear, because the mitzvah is on hearing. And we'll see why this is important. Okay, that is the shofar. Everyone has to have a great deal of kavana to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar. But this is not the consistent and only approach in the Rambam. Look at the next source, the fifth source, in the laws of matzah. Let's say you have a guy who, same Jewish fellow, doesn't know much about Judaism, doesn't know the mitzvah of shofar, also doesn't know the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach. But he goes into Kroger like everyone else, he's buying food, he sees there's a lot of this matzah stuff floating around suddenly, so he buys a box and takes it home, gives it a try. That fateful night, it's Pesach. So does he fulfill his obligation of eating matzah? He didn't know it was Pesach. He didn't know there was a mitzvah to eat matzah. He figured to try it out. He'll eat some matzah tonight. What does he fulfill his obligation? So if the Rambam were being consistent, I see a lot of head shaking this way.
Yes, he
That
will.
if the Rambam were consistent, he would say no. He has to have intent to fulfill the mitzvah. Actually, Pilar is right. He does fulfill the mitzvah even without intent. Look at the Rambam. Achal matzah below kavana. If you eat matzah without intent to fulfill the mitzvah, kagon shan suhu goyim olisim. Like for instance, non-Jews or bandits forced you to eat it. Why they would want to do so is
Cruel and unusual punishment.
well, motivations of bandits are beyond me. But
Eating Rachola.
Is there a difference between active versus
Right.
passive?
what?
Like when you hear, you're just listening,
Matzah,
you're passive. But
Rachola.
here, when you eat the matzah, you're active.
Oh, that's a good. Oh, that's very good. So hang on a second. So if he's forced to eat, yatsa yedei chovaso, he fulfills his obligation. So what's going on? So you have an answer before I ask the question. The Rambam, when we learn the Rambam, we are very, very exacting. We assume the Rambam is precise in all of his words. So even a small variation, a small inconsistency, would give us, a great deal to talk about. This is tremendous. I mean, here he says in one case that without kavana you can't fulfill your mitzvah. Another case without kavana you can fulfill your mitzvah. What's the deal? So Marcus is suggesting that perhaps one is passive, one is active. When you listen, it's really just, you could have been doing anything. You could have been watching TV, having a conversation, you could still hear someone, right? It's very passive. Whereas for matzah, they might have had like your nose closed and might have been gagging you or whatever, forcing something in your throat. But it's an active. You have to at some point swallow, do something. That's actually a good suggestion. But it's not quite where I was going to go with it. But it's a possibility I think we should consider. One thing I've seen, and I think the Rav discusses this, or Rabbi Soloveitchik, he says that the mitzvah of shofar is not just an externally manifested behavior or an action. Matzah is. So in some way he agrees with you. Matzah is an action mitzvah. So it's defined by its action. And if you do the action, whether or not you have intent, you fulfill the mitzvah. But shofar is not that way. Shofar, the mitzvah, as we learn in the third source in the Rambam, is to hear, to listen. And the Rav says that listening is an inherently more internal experience. And for mitzvahs that have an internal experience like that, then you have to it has to be taken more to heart. And you have to have kavanah. If you don't have kavanah, then the internal experience is totally missing. Hearing has something to do with the mitzvah, but not everything at all to do with the mitzvah. The mitzvah is much more than just hearing the sounds. You have to internalize something. And if you're not having in mind, at least, that this is a mitzvah, that God commanded to hear this, and that there's some connection between me and God at this moment, then absolutely does not fulfill the mitzvah. In fact, the Rambam has the same position with regard to Kriyat Shema. When we recite Kriyat Shema, the Rambam also has the position that if it's without kavanah, it's not, you can't fulfill your mitzvah.
But on the same wavelength, you have to say the same thing about the matzah, that this is not just a flat bread. This is, lechem ani and Yetzias Mitzrayim and Gal, redemption. No,
I hear you, John. I think that's true. But at the very most basic level, to fulfill just the bottom baseline of the mitzvah, all one has to do, according to the Rambam, maybe you're right. According to the Rambam, all you have to do is just eat it, right? There is also mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim on Pesach. and you wouldn't fulfill your mitzvah of sipur by just eating matzah. Obviously, you're right. You have to talk about the Pesach, talk about the matzah, talk about maror, right? To discuss the story, say Hallel. There's a lot more to sipur, but to matzah, I'm not sure. The truth is, we're coming up to Sukkot also. The Torah says, gives a reason why we do the mitzvah of sukkah. L'man yedu d'oraseichem ki b'sukos hoshafti es b'nei Yisrael. So that your generation should know. Meaning, the Torah says there's something to know about sukkahs. So because you should know for your generations that I allowed or caused the Jewish people to dwell in sukkos. So a lot of people say that when you perform the mitzvah of sukkah, at least on the first night, that you actually have to have that in mind, that there is a kavanah for it, because the Torah attaches a kavanah. It says to know something. So we have to think about something when we do the mitzvah. It's complicated, but I think the basic thing I'm taking out of this is that for an internally experienced mitzvah, it has to have kavanah attached to it. And that brings us back to tefillah. Tefillah is that internally experienced mitzvah, and that's what we see at the second to last source on the first page. Famous pasuk from the second paragraph of Shema, V'hayayim shamua tishmua mitzvosai. If when you listen to and obey my commandments, asher nochi mitzaveschem, which I command you, hayom, today, le'avas Hashem Elokeichem, to love the Lord your God, u'lavdo b'chol levavchem, and to serve Him with all your hearts, v'chol nafshechem, and all your souls. How do you serve God with all your heart? What is a service that is in your heart? A lot of service is, with your hands, with your feet. I put the tefillin on your arm. You go to the Beis Hamikdash and you bring an animal with your hands. You sacrifice. That's service. That's avoda. What's the service of the heart? So the Gemara asked that question in the first page of Tanis, in the last source. Ezo hi avoda shehi balev. What is worship that is in the heart? Have omer ze tefillah. I would say this is prayer. Prayer is what the Shema refers to, that when we have to worship God in our hearts, that is tefillah. And for that reason, Chanah understood. She was medaberes al liba. She was speaking from her heart. And from her we learn that, from the Shema, that we require kavanah as well. So you can turn the page. And here, today's a good Rambam day. Let's see. Here is what the Gemara thinks about kavanah in prayer. The first Gemara is from Brachos. Rabbi Chia bar Abba Tzali v'Hadar Tzali. Rabbi Chia was a very famous Tana. He was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. He actually was born in Bavel. There were two locations where Jews were kind of developing the Talmud, in Israel and in Babylon. So Rabbi Chia moved from Bavel to Israel in order to learn to become a student of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and that's how, usually it's a good way of telling if someone is from Israel or from Bavel is if they have the word Rebbe in front. Rebbe is often reserved for people from Israel. So Rabbi Chia moved to Israel, so he got not just Chia bar Abba, he's Rebbe Chia bar Abba, he's a rabbi. And he davened one day, Tzali v'Hadar Tzali. He davened, and then he davened again. Tzali is the Aramaic word for davening. That's when we say, there's a Kaddish we say at every tefillah, usually only one per tefillah. It's called Kaddish Tiskabel. The first half of Kaddish is pretty much the same for every single Kaddish. Then the second half changes. Sometimes you only say half Kaddish. Okay, that's easy. Then there's Kaddish Rabbanan, which has a whole paragraph that blesses the people who developed the Gemara. And then there is Kaddish Tiskabel. What does that mean? Tiskabel means please accept. What are we asking God to accept? Tiskabel tzuloson, to accept our prayers. After Shmona Esrei, after the Shmona Esrei unit of Tefillah, that's when Kaddish Tiskabel is said, because we've prayed, and then we say Kaddish, God please accept our prayers. So that word, tzuloson, our prayers, is tzali, same shoresh, right? So he davened and then he davened again, yeah?
Why in a Beis Avel is it the minhag to not say the Tiskabel?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
I'll look it up. No, they still say Kaddish, not the line
Tiskabel,
Tiskabel.
right.
Yeah. I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe it's
We're not
maybe
supposed to ask requests like that.
or maybe it
The only
maybe
thing you don't use is that one line of Tiscabelos Los Avon.
yeah. If I were I'm guessing.
No guessing. I will talk later.
You're right. We're on camera.
Right.
Yes. Amalei Rabbi Zera. So he davened and then davened again. It seemed unusual. So Rabbi Zera says to him, "My time ma'avid marhachi. Why did the master do this? Why did you do this?" Ilema mishum delo. We have to ask first.
Gotta ask who it
Oh,
is.
gotta ask first.
Oh.
Just let the band in.
Yeah, really,
Just
man.
slide whoever in.
He's gonna eat our
No,
raw.
force
I'm
Yeah.
gonna go check the
Now
door.
force us to eat matzah. No.
Band
Oh, I promise you.
That was good.
All right. Ilema mishum delo ki vein mar daite. So why did you daven again? Maybe is it because you did not direct your thoughts? Maybe you didn't have kavanah the first time, so you did it again. V'ha'amar Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Elazar says, Le'olam yimod adam es atzmo. A person should always take stock of himself. Im yachol lechavin es libo. If he sees of himself that he's able to have kavanah, yispalel, then he can daven. V'im lav, and if he knows about himself that he can't have kavanah, lo yispalel. He should not daven at all. So he has a question on Rabbi Chia. It seems that you just davened twice. Maybe you didn't have kavanah the first time, so you davened again. But why did you even daven the first time? He's saying. We know from Rabbi Elazar that if you can't have kavanah, don't bother. It's crazy.
Right.
Then
Oh,
what? No.
I have a question. So, is it not a seven ishma? You know, when you're learning to daven, you don't always have the same kavana that you have once you've learned it. Like when I was starting to daven, I didn't know Hebrew, so it was just struggling through the words. So I think isn't there merit in trying until you get it, until you feel it?
I think so, Shelley, but
Yeah.
I do wonder also, I don't know what kind of kavanah they're talking about.
Right.
Until now, we've been speaking about kavanah only, what does it mean? Intent to do what? Right?
Right. I have an intent
So-
to want to connect, but if I can't, I
Well,
did my best.
right, but let's say with shofar. With shofar, you have the intent, you know all the mystical meanings of the shofar and what each sound represents. I don't,
Okay.
But I usually have in mind I'm fulfilling the mitzvah of hearing shofar, right? So that's one kavanah. You're saying more. You're saying that there's also kavanah for understanding the words, right? And not everyone has that kind of kavanah.
Mhm.
I hear you. Let's.
Oh, you're saying that's not
Well,
necessarily.
I'm not saying
common.
anything. I'm
Okay.
saying
But-
let's see.
But I don't think she meaning to say the meaning of the words,
Yeah.
but more like while you're praying, Kavanah might come in the middle of your prayer and then you start. It's not so much about the meaning of a single word, but about when you start without intention and then you start to read it, oh God.
And then your
and
mind
you
wanders.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get. Hang on. We'll get
Yeah,
there.
but Rabbi,
Yeah.
the whole thing goes back to the first thing, is if you're struggling and you don't understand the words, it's even more that your heart is in it, and that's the whole thing about kavanah, isn't it? That your
Yeah.
heart is in it,
I think so.
so.
That's part of it.
So the heart is there?
I think those are. I think these are. Look, I was in a few minutes when we get there, but for sure,
Sorry.
for sure, if your heart, if you know that you're trying to connect to God, you're trying to pray to Him and come closer to Him, that's a level of kavanah that I think most people don't have anyhow, right? So certainly not only is that praiseworthy, that's something to strive for. A person could just hold that thought the whole davening. And I'm not yet suggesting the person should abandon their prayer. I'm just trying to, build up the importance. That's all. But and you'll see anyhow, there's Rabbi Chia himself has a modified approach. Look at the next source, the second source on the page. Hamispalel tzarech shlichav libo v'chulan. When you daven, you have to have kavanah. You have to direct your heart in all of the brachos. V'im eino yachol lechavin v'chulan. If you're not able to have kavanah in all of your brachos, let's say to not pray at all. No, yechavin es libo be'achas. You should at least have kavanah in one of the prayers, in one of the brachos. Amar Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia says, Amar Rabbi Safra Mishum Chad Rabbi. So Yechiah heard about some position that was said in the yeshiva of Rebbe. After all, he went to study in Rebbe's yeshiva. Which bracha are we talking about? With one of the brachos, Avos, the bracha of the forefathers, which is the very first bracha of Shmona Esrei. So Yechiah suggests that if you can only have kavanah for one bracha, at least have kavanah for the first, the bracha of forefathers.
And still, when they're talking at Tefillah, they're still speaking of the Shemona
Shemona
Esrei.
Esrei.
They're still speaking of
Yeah.
not everything.
So
I bet they want to do that because once he establishes it there, he might carry on into 12.
Yeah, that's a good. Well, look, that's a good suggestion. Give me a second. I was gonna say that, but that's good to remember. Start off good. Let's talk about practical suggestions. Okay. Now, third source on the page is the Rambam. So here there are three Rambams that are discussing how he codifies these Gemaras. Third Rambam, the third source on the page, Rambam from Hilchos Tefillah. Chamisha devarim ma'akfinas tefillah. There are 5 things that, if there are 5 scenarios in which you cannot daven, afal pi shehigia zmana, even if the time for davening has come. So you wouldn't fulfill your mitzvah of davening if these 5 things were obtained. So you shouldn't bother at all. One is taharas yadayim. Your hands have to be pure. You see a lot of people come to shul and they wash their hands, at the washing sinks on either side of the shul or the base medrash. Your hands have to be pure. You can't have been touching something. Like every time I change my baby's diaper, if I want to make a bracha, I have to wash my hands. 3, like 1, 2, 3, like that. You have to wash your hands after going to the bathroom. You have to wash your hands in order to make brachos afterwards and to pray. And next, the kisu ha'erva, covering nakedness. If a person does not have clothes on, that person cannot make brachos, cannot daven. So at least there are 2 parts to this. First of all, a person has to be covered. Also, the Shulchan Aruch quotes, the Mishnah Berurah discusses that a person should also try to have some division on their waist, like a belt, that kind of thing. It's the Hasidim wear gartels for this reason.
Did Adam have kavanah before that?
For a man,
before that?
per se.
Did Adam?
Yeah.
Wait, what?
Before.
Well, I don't know. I think maybe even women should have some. So this is just if a person just has like a different article of clothing for their waist down and one for their. Maybe all dresses don't have. Maybe you're right.
I heard even underpants can serve as.
Yeah, Rav Moshe. So what happened? So this is so when I went to Israel, when I went to yeshiva after high school, this is when I discovered this halacha, and it happened to be that I bought some kind of a suit or something before going to Israel, and the suit I bought it from a secondhand store, and I wasn't aware of it. Whatever, it fit me, so what I care, But it didn't have any belt loops. It was designed for suspenders. So when I read this, that Mishnah Berurah suggests should we wear belts? I kind of. The truth is, Rav Moshe says you don't really need a belt as long as anything at all kind of goes around your waist, even the elastic rim of your underwear. So that's enough. But I didn't like going into davening thinking I was yotzer by my underwear. So I actually bought a gartel to wear on Shabbos when I wore that suit underneath my suit jacket. It was the most Lithuanian excuse for wearing a gartel ever in history.
Why?
They have that
Why
the
did-
secondhand store
Yeah,
too.
but did Rev Moshe or anyone ever
Goodwill
say
garden.
why you're supposed to have that separation?
Separate the upper half from the lower half.
Yeah,
The lower half.
so
doesn't
partly,
have the
so
same
this is also
function.
Hasidic. So someone asked me once on an airplane or something, why do they wear the hair with the side? So why do we have payas all the way? Oh, this was, actually no, I remember this. I taught 2 years ago at the Kings Bay Y in Brooklyn. I was the Jewish educator for a JCC, and mostly I ran a Hebrew school, but I was a Jewish educator overall. So the JCC was having a group of Muslim teenagers. They were Turkish Muslim teenagers coming to the JCC to just see what Judaism was like. And I was the director of the JCC was going to give a breakdown of Jewish history in an hour.
On 1 foot.
For the next 45 minutes, I had to teach them all about Torah. After they'd already been bored to tears
death, yeah.
with. So I started off, I was like, listen, I'm not going to cover a lot, but do you have any questions? I'll start off with questions. And no one said a word. They were just, so I warmed them up a little bit. I showed them what a tallis was, what candlesticks were, a mezuzah. And then I offered questions again. And this was the first question I got. That I heard that the Jews who grow these long, I heard that so that they can get into heaven. And I was like, that's the one thing you heard about Judaism that it does. Rav Nachman of Breslov says, that if you grow your payas long, then I'll pull you by your payas to heaven. But like, it's such an esoteric, I was like, that's what you heard, whatever. So Hasidim wear payas. I think one of the ideas is to connect our minds to our hearts, which actually has a lot to do with tefillah. That it shouldn't be without our hearts. Our hearts have to be connected into everything that our minds control. So they connect, and that's also why they don't wear ties. They don't wear neckties because they don't want to separate their heads from their hearts. They want to develop more connection. But they will wear a tie around their waist, or belts or something, because they want to separate their baser instincts from their more lofty aspirations and potential. So, there you have it. Anyhow, that's one of the things. If you're naked, you can't daven. So, v'taharas makom
Go
haTefillah.
back to the question then. Was Adam doing before he had eaten of the fruit of the forbidden fruit?
Was he?
Did he have kavana?
Well, he didn't have base instincts.
Really?
That-
Yeah.
Right,
There's no
He
He
problem.
might have been
Yeah,
naked,
so-
but he wasn't
right.
Oh,
That's a
wow.
good point.
quite based. It's a good point, Alan.
Good point.
Only afterwards did God give him clothing, actually.
So God created man and then woman, but without the intent.
What order they were created?
Well, okay, whatever it says
I
there.
would take us
Okay.
varying time and topics.
Come Parshas Bereishis, we'll have a discussion.
I do the parsha shmooze every week, some pastor in the morning.
But the question is, of course, is you were given all the equipment, but without intent to use it until after the eating forbidden fruit. Is that what you're saying?
No.
Maybe
It's a good question. A lot of people do say that, but we really can't get into it here. I'm sorry. Believe me, I want to, because I could go on for hours, but then they wouldn't want to. So I'm sorry. Okay. All right. And taharas makom tefillah. The place of davening has to be pure. So, also when I change a diaper at home, I can't daven before the diaper has been removed from the. If it's a dirty diaper, it has to be removed from the area. Can't say kiddush if the baby has a dirty diaper. It's not. The place of davening has to. Well, again, if you can't smell it, if that's such an issue. But if paste smells bad, it happened also in yeshiva a lot, and in YU it happened a lot. One of the old base medrash at YU, it used to be called the main base. I think it's still the main base, but they moved to a new fancy schmancy facility. So whenever they would, I think once a month, some truck would come by and supply someone with oil nearby, and it would reek. It was awful. You couldn't, you'd become dizzy. It was like getting high or something. Really, it was prohibited to daven under those circumstances. If it smells that bad, you can't. So the place where you're davening has to be controlled. That's actually connected to the next idea. But the very something that's rushing you or distracting you. You can't daven in a place where or at a time when you are too rushed and distracted. For instance, if you have to go to the bathroom, you can't daven. You have to go to the bathroom first and then daven. You can't be holding it I can hold it into the end. This is not davening, right?
Is that because of rushing?
It's because your mind, I think ultimately, it has to do with the next point, the chavana salev, directing the heart. That if you don't have kavana for whatever other reason, then that's not davening, according to the Rambam. So he seems to hold the first more that we learned, that if you can't have kavana, don't bother. It's not worth it. In fact, look at the next Rambam. It's wild. It's kavanas halev ketzad. Rambam explains what he means. What does it mean, directing the heart? Kol tefillah she'ena b'kavana ena tefillah. Any davening that was done without kavana is not davening at all. This is the second to last verse on the page. V'im hispalel below kavana, chozer hispalel b'kavana. If you daven without kavana, you have to go back to the very beginning and do it all over again, this time with kavana. Now, Matzah daito mishubeshes v'libo tarud. If you see that your mind is mixed up and your heart is bothered, asur lo lihispalel ad shetisyashev da'ata. This is the bold line. It is prohibited, forbidden, for you to daven until your thoughts have been settled. Lefichach, therefore, this is just haba min haderech. If you're coming from some trip, v'hu ayef, and someone who comes from a trip and he's tired, or metzar, and he's like stressed, asur lihispalel ad shetisiyashiv daito. It is forbidden for him to daven until his thoughts have been settled. I think he means also people who are like, they're running into davening, like sweating, and they ran up the stairs and they were late. Can't daven yet. Amru chachamim. And the sages said as a piece of advice. I wouldn't say it if he didn't write it. Yisheh shlosha yamim ad she'anuach b'tiskar daitu. Maybe wait a few days. Wait for 3 days until you've been able to rest from your trip and your thoughts have, settled a little bit. Ve'achar kach yispalel, and then daven afterwards. Can you imagine the guy sitting in shul waiting for 3 days until his...
So what do you do about I guess, okay, so you make it, let's say you had a hellacious trip,
Yeah.
and you're like, I can't get my mind off whatever. The toll, the gasoline was too high, the kids were crying, so you rest for 3 days, like, you know what, I'm not going to shul for 3 days,
Yeah.
it's just the way it is.
Yeah, I'm building that question. So
Okay.
that's what I'm trying to...
Okay.
What do you do? Exactly. Ketzad hiya kavana, and what is kavana, says the Rambam, the last 2 lines. She'ifanes libo mikol machshavos, you have to clear your heart of all thoughts, v'yira'a asmo, v'yira'a atzmo, ki'ilu hu omed lifnei hashchina. And you should see yourself as if you are standing before God's presence. So what do you do? Okay, not even that. Look at this. Look at the last source. Mi shehispalel v'lo kivenes libo. This is still the Rambam. This is 6 chapters later. If you davened and did not direct your heart, yachzor v'yispal b'kavana, like we said before, go back to the beginning and do it again, this time with kavana. V'im kivenes libo b'bracha rishona, and if you have kavana just for the first bracha, shuv v'nosarich, then you don't have to have any more kavana after that. So before we get to your question totally, because the practical stuff we'll discuss in a second, but
So is this referring to like the first paragraph of the Shemona Esrei?
the first paragraph of Shemona
The
Esrei.
forefathers.
Exactly. The first paragraph, this is all the lead-in by the way, to the first paragraph. So our homework for next week, not next week because it's Erev Rosh Hashanah, for in 2 weeks.
Shabbos Shuvah, or the Sunday after.
Right. Our homework is to read and learn and know the translation of the first paragraph of Shemona Esrei. That's what we're doing next time. Anyhow, the Rambam said very clearly in the first 2 sources we read of the Rambam that if you daven without kavana, it's garnished, it's nothing, don't bother. You just were, could have been talking on the phone. Then he says in the last source, really just the first bracha. So which one is it? Maybe you want to say that the first 2 sources were just talking about the first bracha, perhaps, but I don't think that's what he was talking about. Called tefillah she'ina b'kavana, tefillah. Any tefillah that does not have kavana is not a tefillah at all. Sounds to me like the rest of the 18 other brachos after the first one wouldn't be tefillah according to the Rambam. Yeah.
I think he's saying you should be striving to be able to have kavanah for the whole thing. But b'diavad, if you got the first one down, we understand that, it's not like in the old days, when all you had to do was till a field or, things are more complicated. And that was 200 years ago, 400 years ago.
1,000 years ago.
1,000 years ago.
You said.
Interesting. So John is saying, that the first 2 sources that we learned in the Rambam says prohibited to daven without kavana. A daven that's not with kavana is not davening at all. That's the ideal. That's what we call the chatchila. Antecedently approaching davening, we would say, that's what we should try for. But if you did it anyhow, b'diavad means if you did it and it kind of happened, and at least you had kavana for the first bracha, that's good enough. You don't have to really, return to the beginning. Interesting. Any other ideas? Yeah.
I have a question. So which is more important? If you had a whole bunch of stress and you had to miss davening because you're required to daven, but if you can't do it without kavanah, then which is better? It's better not to do it at all than, right?
So, okay. Practical in a second. Yeah? First we're just abstract. Yeah?
So I was going to say, so the first bracha there, in regard to the forefathers, that's where you're connecting to Hashem. That's where you're trying to establish this unique relationship like he had with, the Avos. So if your intent is there, and even, let's say, after that first bracha, your mind does kind of wander a little bit.
Uh-huh.
But I don't know.
Establish something.
That's
So,
what I'm saying.
You're kind of a bridge between Mark and what Chaim of Brisk said. Chaim Brisk, Chaim Brisker, it's often called, he lived in the second half of the 19th century, died in 1918, and was born in Volozhin and eventually moved to Brest, Brisk, in Belarus, and became one of the seminal figures of our tradition. The Rav, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, was his grandson. Rav Chaim of Brisk had two sons, Rabbi Yosef Dov, Rabbi Yitzhak Zev, who is the Brisker Rav, and Moshe. Moshe Soloveitchik was Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik's father. Okay, anyhow, he's a famous and important guy. He established what is called the Brisker method. He dealt with halacha. He focused more on defining things abstractly, on categorizing different halachos and categorizing different opinions, and became much more cerebral and organized. And he emphasized especially study of the Rambam. So he wrote very famous work on the Rambam, and he addresses this exact issue. In one place, the Rambam seems to stress that without total kavana, it's worthless. And then in another place, he says at least the first bracha. So he says there's different kinds of kavana, going back to Shali's point earlier. There's different kinds of kavana. Some kavana is just, I'm doing a mitzvah, I'm standing before God, I'm talking to God now. That's one kind of kavana. Another kind of kavana is, I can hear, I understand all the words. When I say all the words, I know what I'm talking about, I know what I'm saying. So Rav Chaim suggested that that's what's going on here. When the Rambam says that you have to have kavanah or it's not tefillah, what he meant is you have to know you're standing before God. You have to know, and that's how he ends off the second to last source. Yira'eh atzmo ki'ilu hu omed b'pnei hashchina. You have to see yourself as if you're standing before God. A lot of times you'll see on shuls, an Amrit that says that, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. It says on top on the Aron, Dalifnei miyata omed. Know before whom you are standing. It's not just standing before Rabbi Zach. And our very illustrious president. Although we are standing before them too. That's
Even though he's checking.
Yes, that makes us accountable in some way. But we're standing before someone, capital someone, right? Capital S. We're standing before God. God is there. And that awareness, if a person doesn't have that awareness in tefillah, a person isn't davening, right? Because what's the words for if you're not trying to at least approach God? That's the whole purpose of tefillah, is to get closer to God. At least stand before Him and say something. Even if you don't know what you're saying, but at least to stand before Him. If you don't know you're standing before God, what is it? Right? To say the words of davening, it's not a practice that was set up like the mitzvah to daven, right? Let's say the mitzvah to daven. So you have to say the words, right? Imagine someone who he heard somewhere, there's some kind of the Jews daven, right? They have this book and they say these words. So I don't know why they do it, I don't know what it's for, but Jews seem successful people. They're doctors and lawyers and senators and all kinds of crazy things. So he gets a sitter and he starts to say the words. Would you say that's davening, right? What's davening? Essentially, davening means that you're really praying. And praying implies that you're talking to God. You're approaching God. You might not know even what to say, what the content of the prayer is. But without God in the picture, saying words is just reading words, right? Sometimes people would say, I'll give an illustration. There are some people who some people even in the Jewish religion, who don't quite acknowledge the state of Israel. And because of this political opinion, it also affects halachically how they approach Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut. Is it appropriate? I don't know, that's not discussion today. But so some people will try to sometimes a chumrah means that you're trying to fulfill two different positions. So some people go off to seminary, go off to yeshiva in Israel, and they feel like I can do both of these things. I can both not really acknowledge Israel, but also say Hallel. How? After davening, I'll sit down with a book of Tehillim, and as if I'm learning, I'll learn through that section of Tehillim that has Hallel. I'll just read it, right? I'll read it as Tehillim, but not as Hallel. So this is a very ridiculous thing to say. either it's Hallel or not. Hallel isn't words. Hallel means you're praising God. If you're saying the words not to praise God for something, but just to read them, that's not Hallel. That's just reading, like, well, it sounds silly almost, you know? That's exactly, I keep saying it, but it's a wonderful, because I used to teach, you know, little kids. You say a kid, you know, say sorry. It's like, sorry, you know? It's like, that's not an apology, that's just the word sorry coming out of his mouth, you know? Apologizing means that you see something that's wrong, to say, no, say it like you mean it. I'm really sorry, you know? You can't just say it like you mean it. You have to actually mean it. It doesn't make any sense, you know? So that's our crimes. That's most of tefillah, but there's also even more kavanah that a person's supposed to have, at least for the first paragraph, and that is the meaning of the words. And that's the meaning of the words. So, and that's what the Rambam says at the end, if you only have kavanah for the first paragraph, don't go back to repeat it. Meaning if you only focus on the words in the first paragraph, that's enough to at least continue knowing that you're standing before God alone. Maybe you're thinking of other things. Maybe you're thinking about, you know, you start to, in a good way, maybe a person comes by honestly, they come to the bracha b'rfa'inu of healing us, but we think, you know, I have a friend, God forbid, who could need refuah, and then the bracha continues, and the truth is I had to cook a meal for them, and then I forgot to do the dishes at home, so I can't really cook the meal yet, you know, and like by the time you finish that thought process, you're taking 3 steps backwards already, you know, you don't know where you're, so, that's understandable, and it doesn't mean that you forgot that you were in a shul, that you were talking to God, you know, but sometimes you get distracted. So that's the plan solution. Perhaps for the first paragraph Shema Esrei to know what the words mean, and for the rest of it just to know that you're standing before God. So let's answer some of the practical questions. First of all, let's say you don't know the meaning of the words, right? So I'm pretty sure that a person in that situation could daven in whatever language they do understand, right? Even in English. I think that would be very important. Is it possible for people to learn, you know, the meanings of the word? It's possible, you know, it does take time, but you're right. I think at least at the outset, to at least daven in English is something valuable. Today, we don't really, like, let's say you really do go for Shemona Esrei and realize, oh my gosh, I didn't have kavanah at any point for the last 5 minutes, you know. We don't repeat Shemona Esreis anymore. And that's because partly, you know, if you didn't have kavanah the first time around, who says you'll have it the second time around? You could be there all day long trying to go through it, you know. So we try to keep it to one. Adding an additional tefillah is a big deal. You know, we take it very seriously. The bracha is saying God's name. Take that very, very seriously. So we don't really practice that anymore. Back in the days when they had more, I guess, you know, maybe they were more on top of things, and they really took it much more. Kavanah to them meant much more, and really they related to it much more. So they practiced this way. They would repeat Shemona Esrei.
We also didn't have as many prayers as we have now. I mean, it's like every 10 years we're adding an extra.
Well, yes and no. The Gemara discusses the Vasikin. We call the Vasikin people, you know, who get up for the early davening when the sun rises. Vasikin means ancient ones. And the ancient tradition, they used to say, was they would daven for 3 hours. 1 hour preparing for Shemona Esrei, 1 hour saying Shemona Esrei, and 1 hour recovering from Shemona Esrei. That was just Shemona Esrei alone. So yeah, yes and no. I mean, we do, but we don't. I mean, the 45 minutes we spend in davening every morning, I don't think is as much time as they spent. But it is a good point to say that perhaps our lives may be more busy. You know, they had perhaps more time in the fields to kind of, you know, appreciate God's creation and connect to the creative universe. Polar than, yeah.
It wouldn't be considered if you could repeat again that prayer to use the name of God in vain?
Again, if it would have kavanah, no, it would not be a waste of an abuse of God's name. Not only that, but there is a concept of a tefillas nadava. You know, this is beyond us, but our tefillos, right, are supposed to represent the korbanos that we had. There are some korbanos that you could bring, not because you're obligated to it, because you volunteer a korban. Back in the Mikdash, it could be not, you know, yeah, you have to bring a korban on Sukkot, you know, whenever you come to the Mikdash. But maybe it's a regular Wednesday, I want to bring a korban to God. You can bring a korban nadava, volunteered korban. So you can also theoretically bring a volunteer tefillah too. Feel moved, you want to talk to God, you open up Shemona Esrei. We don't do that anymore either. It has to be under very, very, very strict conditions and circumstances. Like, because we take it really very seriously, and unless we're 100% sure about our focus and about our hearts and minds, we really recommend against it. Yeah.
I had two questions. One, what about like Rosh Chodesh? It says specifically if you forget the.
Yeah, well, if you forget,
Yeah,
so let's
Love.
say, if you
Says
forget,
repeat back.
yeah, so let's say,
I've done that before, and I've gone back to the beginning.
yeah, me too, everyone does, yeah, I do all the time. That's different. If you actually miss the words themselves, like if you skip Yalav Yavon Rosh Chodesh, or if you miss the first bracha of Shemona Esrei any day of the week, you have to go back to the beginning and start over.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's less abstract and in the air than our kavana. That's more like, at least say the words, you know. Yeah.
One time I think I did mincha at the Kollel, and then I came here for Marav, and I did mincha again by accident, and I asked, and it was, well, you brought an extra korbanos or whatever. And
Yeah.
It wasn't portrayed to me as bad as like you're kind of like saying that, well, if you do it twice.
Yeah, a lot of people do the opposite. A lot of people do mincha twice, because I'll daven.
No, I did mincha twice.
Oh,
by
you did mincha
accident.
twice.
I
Yeah.
forgot I had done mincha already.
I mean, you
So-
daven, and sometimes you catch an early minyan, and then you
Yeah.
come back for your later minyan and forgot that you davened early, and do
Right.
it again. So then, yeah, I wouldn't, you know.
I'm not sweating about it.
I
I'm
wouldn't
just
lash
saying it
yourself
just
over
wasn't
it.
such
Yeah.
a bad thing.
But yeah, so in that case, we do suggest perhaps the extra tefillah was just, volunteered. So that's yeah.
Well, just kind of going back to Hannah and her, prayer to Allah. I mean, she was such a troubled person at the time. She was, so distressed and so distracted. And so in some ways it was so easy for her to pour her heart out because, that's what was troubling her. We're not always, we're not necessarily in that shape. I mean, she was like a train wreck. I mean, she was just so, you know what I mean? That was constantly on her mind. That
Yeah.
she was like obsessed with it.
Yeah.
So in some reason, not that we should be obsessed with things, to that extent, but to me, for her to be able to pour her heart out, it just was like such a natural thing for her to do.
Yeah, look, and maybe some tefillos definitely have more tears and more pouring out than others do, but approaching God can occur anywhere, anytime. And even in a simple and basic way, we all have that ability. So, and it could be in good times. That's what this last week's parsha was about. Kisavo. You should why do we have the curses? Because we didn't worship God with simcha and with goodness of heart, mirov kol, from having so much abundance and so much blessing and bounty. Not because we were train wrecks and had to pour our hearts out. There's another way of approaching God, and that's from joy and everything in between. So I hear you, and I'd say there is a range, but we all have the ability, and the truth is it can take training. Now, when I learned this, I first learned this Reb Chaim when I was this was my interview. I was asked to read this Reb Chaim about the two different kinds of kavana and what parts of Shemona Esrei when I was in high school interviewing for the yeshiva that I ultimately went to in Israel for high school. I had to read the Reb Chaim and see if I could translate it, then he wanted to see if I could read it, understand it. So he wanted to know if I had kavana during, so. But after that, I actually took it very seriously, and that year, I tried to train myself, and this is actually where a lot of my thoughts and understanding of tefillah came just from what I'm about to tell you. That year, I probably spent on average each Shemona Esrei maybe half an hour or so saying it, and it was because I took it very seriously. I wanted to say every word in the first paragraph with kavana. Now, I had the luxury of being in a yeshiva. It didn't matter if I was late, to breakfast, or I had no responsibility to anyone but myself. So it was a nice time to spend half an hour davening, half an hour on each Shemona Esrei alone. And the way it would go is this: I would maybe start off with Baruch Atah Hashem is easy, Then your eyes are closed, maybe your eyes are open. Doesn't matter. Your mind, after 3 words, then it starts to wander, and I would let it go. I would stand there and let every thought process run itself out to the end until it was totally done. People thought I was so holy, right? 27 minutes of that time was spent thinking about other things. But I would wait. I would wait for my patience for myself to come back to the Word and come back to God and to refocus it. And eventually I was able to close it down. Now, obviously do not have that much kavanah as I had back then. Or the truth is any time in my youth, oftentimes children have an easier time having kavanah, I think, than adults. Partly because children are more able to appreciate what's magic and spiritual in the world, and we become much more rational, and we see what's before us, and that's really all that becomes important. But also because I think children in general, I don't know if the women and men distinction is true, but certainly the children-adult distinction I think is true. That children have a stronger connection, I think, to their creator. Or at least have the potential to have that connection. So, and that's, so here we go. So it would be, really I only did that primarily for the first bracha. But half the time, like the first 15 minutes, let's say, was spent on the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, and then I would kind of be a little bit easier going for the last 15 minutes. And partly because what Mark's suggestion is actually true. If you start off strong, it's easier to finish strong. So starting off in the first bracha is a great idea. Really thinking about each word, really focusing, and then moving on. It's easier than starting off, jumping right into it and then trying to find your way in the middle. But I would say another great advice for kind of bringing yourself back is every time you pass the word Baruch, it comes every single at the end of each bracha. Whenever you turn back to God, Baruch Atah Hashem, to stop your mind, come back, pause maybe for a minute to clear your head, and then to finish off the bracha and start off the next one strong. So I think that's definitely another good piece of advice.
Right, but that
Yeah.
just brings another thing to point. Like when we do the Shemona Esrei, it seems like, the repetition starts, I'm like not even close to being done, and
Yeah.
like people like zip through it.
So two things. Well, first of all, people have to go to work and there's responsibilities, that's
let's
understandable.
say Shabbos.
But let's say, so there are two different ways to go about it. Either just start your Shemona Esrei, take as long as you need, and when they get to Kedusha, right, in the repetition, so just, if you're at the place where Kedusha would normally go, you could say Kedusha along with them. If you're in Shema Koleinu, at the place where you can stick in any tefillah, you could say Kedusha there.
Mhm.
If you're not those two places, then I would say not to say anything at all, just to listen carefully, listen to the Kedusha after they move on, so you move on in your Shemona Esrei. If there could be a Muzumin, perhaps, if we finish the question soon. Then, the other recommendation is some people, they wait, they don't say their Shemona Esrei with everyone else, they wait till after Kedusha in the repetition, and immediately when the Kedusha is over, then they start with their own private saying and they go on for as long as they need. So those are the two recommendations.
What is the second division if you're not in the Kedusha or if you are in which other section?
If you wait, the second thing I just said now is if you feel like you can't, you'll be too distracted, you can't make it in time, you need longer, so then when everyone else starts Shemona Esrei, that's when you should be focusing your mind, meditating a little bit, and waiting for the repetition to start. And as they start the repetition and wait for the Kedusha to end, after Kedusha, then to start your Shemona Esrei.
No, I think she's asking about, was it Shema Koleinu?
Shema
Where
Oh.
you can stick in your...
So if you look in the art scroll, and you get to Shema Koleinu, there's towards the end of the bracha, it says, M'ufanacha malkeinu reikam al teshivenu. From before you, God, you're standing before God, right? From before you, do not send us away empty-handed. At that point, you'll see there's a little bubble, like a footnote sign in the art scroll. At the bottom, it says, you can stick in any prayer you want here. It gives two suggestions of prayers that you could stick in, one for forgiveness for sins and one for help with parnasa. But you could say anything you want. So you could...
That's not on Shabbat.
That's not, she made a good point, that's not on Shabbat.
All right, on Shabbos we don't
Yeah,
ask
we
for
don't.
requests,
That's right.
for personal requests.
So there weren't
So
any
you
places
can't,
there.
then there wasn't that opportunity on Shabbat.
On Shabbat, no, right.
So the only opportunity would be if you happen to be at the Kedusha right then.
Yeah, otherwise I would just...
Chances are you're probably not gonna.
Probably not. Yeah, I usually, when that happens to me, I usually just hold my... Now if you're in the last, we'll learn the finer details, but if you're in the last paragraph, which is not a bracha at all, right, it'll kind of... It's sort of shoni, when you ask God to watch your tongue and for other, for some other requests, there you can answer for the three important lines, Kadosh, 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 Baruch Kavod, Baruch Hashem, so you can answer kind of there. You wouldn't say Amen until you really finish one answer, but we'll learn that later. But in the meantime, if you're in doubt, just you listening. Remember, that's where we started off with, is listening, right? Just listening. In halacha, we have a concept called shomea ka'ona. If you hear something, if you really listen to it, it's as if you respond. It's as if you say it. Shofar, the mitzvah is to hear the shofar. Megillah is not that way. Megillah, we say, right, is on reading the Megillah. Al mikra Megillah. The bracha is on reading the Megillah, not on hearing the Megillah. So we don't read the Megillah. I don't read the Megillah. You don't read the Megillah.
Follow.
We hear someone else read it. And the reason is because if you're really listening with a great deal of intent, it's as if you say it yourself. So same thing for the Kedusha. If you can't answer because you're in Shemona Esrei, maybe you're in Shema, the place where you can't stop, then just listening carefully and really trying to internalize, really having focus. And that's where we started off. It's as if it comes out of your heart and your mouth. So
you're saying if you're in a place that you stop you stop saying the word,
yeah,
and you just listen,
just focus and listen,
and then you continue on.
Exactly.
Is the Nesiat Kapayim, the raising the hands, that's mentioned with the Halachot Tefillah, with the Kohanim do?
Yeah.
So they put them together like?
The Rambam groups those halachos in one chapter, or not one chapter, but one unit.
Oh, it's the heading of the whole unit, not
Yeah.
that particular one.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I have that one question
Yeah.
about the practicality, that if you,
Yeah, so
there,
I would recommend, that if you don't have kavanah, look, first of all, the very basic kavanah is, I'm in shul, I'm davening to God, right? I think that any of us really could, even in a very dire and stressed out situation, look, if it's too stressful, so maybe wait an hour, maybe go deal with what you have to deal with and then come back to it, But overall, I think most of the things that we're bothered with during the day, we can overcome one way or another to squeeze in a prayer, right? And even if a person doesn't know the meaning of the words, again, English is available, and even if it's not available, at least to say the words, but to have in mind when standing before God, I think has a great deal of value in trying to approach God. So, and it takes a lot of practice to help train ourselves, a lot of meditation to help make sure that we're able to focus in those situations. But we don't give these dispensations anymore, really. Like, wait 3 days. Believe me, when I got back from Michigan with Ricky, I didn't want to come to shul at all, but we do what we have to do, yeah. All right, so hopefully we should be sensitive and hearing and really listening to all of the very powerful and beautiful mitzvahs we have around us this time of year, and that should have a very profound internal impact, and our feelings should be in that way very effective.
Amen.
Amen.